Hello, I'm James Preston from ANSecurity. In this short presentation, I'm going to look at how centralized logging technologies can be applied to the NHS's Data Security and Protection Toolkit, which has been updated for the 2021 to 2022 period. Starting out with, there are actually quite a few limited direct references to centralized logging throughout the DSPT. However, centralized logging can really help meet some of the requirements, meet some of the specification items of the DSPT. And equally so, for some areas where it's not directly helping to meet those requirements, there are definitely some side benefits, some additional returns on investment that you can obtain by adopting a centralized logging service to not meet just the requirements of the DSPT, but also some typical cybersecurity best practices. So I'm going to start by looking at the 5 core areas which we've identified which are directly relevant to centralized logging, starting out with point 423 there, where logs are retained for a sufficient period and can be reviewed regularly and searched to identify malicious activity. And typically here we see organizations keep logs on the systems that actually generate them. So this might be our Windows computers, servers, and firewalls, for instance. And what we really recommend here is that organizations retain logs for at least 6 months. And here this is related to the typical attack life cycle of a cyber threat actor. So looking to gain access to a system, perform some reconnaissance before then. Once they've got access to the system, they'll then start to see what other systems they can access inside that environment, see how they can elevate permissions, and then eventually exfiltrate data or achieve their actions on objective. And we call this the cyber attack life cycle. And typically, we see that going up to about 6 months now. So for those organizations that are still keeping the logs on the systems that generate them, when it comes to Windows computers, we really recommend upgrading the Windows event log storage size to about 2 to 4 gigabytes in most cases. And this will obtain a sufficiently large amount of space to keep that 6 months of storage of the appropriate log information. When it comes to actually shipping this information up to a centralized logging service, though, it's really handy to identify the entry points into your network and use that as the initial place to take that information and centralize it. This might be authentication servers, this might be web servers which are published out to the internet, your firewalls, for instance, or any other system which is accessible from the internet or is indeed easy to take the log information off for login events. If you haven't already just come across the Sysmon client from Microsoft as well, it's a really helpful tool which can open up Windows logging to something that's a lot easier to read and understand. There are a couple of other features inside Sysmon as well that capture logs which are very relevant to cybersecurity and can really help identify logs which are relevant to threat actors attempting to elevate permissions, to threat actors attempting to perform malicious actions against Windows computers. And by taking this information across disparate systems and centralizing them, we've got the opportunity now, of course, to perform historic analysis. So if we get a list of indicators of compromise, a list of IP addresses or file hashes for known malicious executables, for instance, we can very quickly search across a wide array of systems and see if those files have been seen, see if client computers have attempted to reach out to those malicious addresses. Moving on now to point 452, so having technical controls which enforce a password policy to mitigate against password guessing attacks. And quite often we will find that our users are going to be the first ones to inform us about a password guessing attack. And that's because they've been potentially locked out of their computer account. But by taking the information across a variety of authentication sources, this might be Azure AD, this might be your on-premise Active Directory or another authentication service like Okta or Duo, and centralizing that log information, we can start to identify the accounts which might be exposed to threat actors trying to guess the passwords, threat actors using lists of known breached passwords or lists of common passwords to see if that matches up with that user's account. And by taking that intelligence, we can then perhaps apply additional security measures to protect those accounts using MFA, restricting those accounts so that they can only be accessed from trusted geographical areas or trusted countries, for instance, whilst blocking out those threat actors using the log information which has been centrally aggregated as a intelligence source to help inform further policy. Moving on to some more core areas, here we've got point 511, so the ability to actually perform a root cause analysis as part of any lessons learned following a data security incident. And all too often we see organizations that have had a data security incident don't have the information available to hand to be able to quickly identify what was the chain of events, where was the initial compromise, which user account was affected, what data was affected. And by taking log information, we can establish that root cause analysis. We can see if a user account has been brute forced. We can see what files were then accessed by that user account by matching against the file history logs on a computer or a file server, for instance. And we can then actually build out that chain of events, see what's happened after that point, and actually make informed decisions again to improve our security posture in the future to prevent similar attacks. Next up, we've got point 633. So having a proportionate monitoring system to detect cyber events on systems and services. And here we're actually taking just centralized logging systems and kind of uplifting them to a full-on SIEM system. So the ability to ingest log information, normalize and enrich that information to actually be able to detect an alert on a cybersecurity event. And what you'll find is that these SIEM systems have built into them is the ability to match against frameworks like the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So identifying common ways that a threat actor will gain access to a system, seeing if a pattern of behavior has changed within a user account. Perhaps normally they log in at 9 o'clock, but suddenly they're seeing logging in at 2 o'clock from a country outside of the United Kingdom. And this can then, again, inform our defenses, ensure that threat actors don't have the ability to obtain that initial foothold onto a system. And if you haven't already come across the MITRE ATT&CK framework, it's a really handy framework which provides real-world knowledge of the known tactics and techniques used by threat actors. And I really recommend that you get a A1 printed copy of the MITRE ATT&CK framework, put it up on a pinboard somewhere, and use a highlighter to identify which parts of that framework do you have detections in place for. Can you detect different techniques and tactics which are used by those threat actors, and use that to inform decisions in the future as to where you might improve your security systems. The final core area is, of course, ensuring that logs are effectively privileged information and ensuring that only authorized users can actually access that information. Only authorized users can parse and get the alerts out of that information. And of course, here again, you'll find that centralized log management systems keep logs themselves, including activities performed by administrators. So if an administrator on a logging system is seen perhaps behaving oddly or accessing data at a peculiar hour, that can be alerted on as well, of course. So if we now move into some areas which are not necessarily directly related to logging, but certainly where logging can help achieve compliance and help really drive security forwards within an organization, we've got point 614 here, where individuals affected by a breach are appropriately informed. And again, by using the log information, we can establish a chain of events, see which data has been accessed in the event of a detected threat. And then by identifying that information, we can identify the data owners, we can identify the data subjects that might be stored inside that information. And of course, then get in touch saying, this is the timeline of events, make informed decisions as to which people we do indeed need to get in touch with in the event of a data breach, instead of just reaching out to our entire user base or our entire patient base, for instance. When it comes to point 424, having unnecessary user accounts removed or disabled, of course, even with the best will in the world, not necessarily every HR process is going to detect users that are joining, leaving, moving within the organization. And here in particular, we can use logging to identify across a variety of systems when users stop logging into those systems, perhaps because they've left the organization. Or equally so, if a user that has left the organization is still attempting to log into that organization, and perhaps that map that out with other information, like were they a disgruntled employee, have they now left under unfortunate circumstances and now looking to use their previous permissions to conduct malicious activities, of course. And we've also seen centralized logging services being used to identify service accounts that might be inappropriately set up, in particular where a standard user account is used in place of what we would traditionally use for a service account as well. Just based upon that user's activity, seeing the login time, seeing what data they're accessing through that centralized pane of glass. A couple of final areas to touch on with point 714, using some form of potential threat intelligence source to make security changes in response to new threats. And what we see organizations with a centralized logging service do is actually generate their own internal threat intelligence. For instance, if we've got a variety of different systems, perhaps our firewall and our endpoint agents that can detect malware, we can use that level of detections to inform our decision-making processes, perhaps identify how that malware might be getting into our networks in the first place, perhaps through phishing emails, for instance. And by seeing that increase in a trend over a short period of time and seeing that potential surge of phishing attempts against our users, we can use that as a moment to decide now is the point that we need to go out and get some education in the hands of our users. Say, now is the time to do some phishing simulations or some education around the common indicators of a phishing email. When it comes to point 442, having some mechanism of detecting the malicious or excessive use of high privileged accounts, in particular relating to email and web browsing, we see a number of organizations use a technical control to enforce these protections, technical controls to prevent administrative accounts from reaching out to email or web browsing services. But of course, we can also use a logging environment to detect if users that perhaps don't have this technical control in place are indeed excessively using their administrative accounts to access email and web browsing. And again, alert, inform, and educate around this as well. So to finish off, I've got a short scenario as to how centralized logging might be used to help remediate a cybersecurity threat inside an organization. So in this instance, an NHS trust perhaps has been informed that some files have been publicly leaked onto the internet, and those files have non-public personally identifiable information inside them. As part of the information about that leak, the organization has actually been given some file names, some common indicators as to what those file types are as well. And typically, this is where that story ends. The organization blames sophisticated threat actors. The media gets to run this story a couple of times, and everyone doesn't really understand what's actually happened. But by using a centralized logging service, we can examine the logs to see which users have been accessing those files and perhaps correlate that with other events. Perhaps we correlate that with our directory logs, in instance, and find that a single user who has been accessing those files has had multiple failed login attempts over a period of time, indicating that potentially that account has eventually been compromised with a successful login attempt. And of course, because we've now got the identity that has been compromised, we can have a look at what other files have been accessed by that user, what other data might have been leaked out onto the internet in some manner. And of course, we can now take action against that account. We can identify perhaps was malware the vector for that user to be compromised. Perhaps malware was used to exfiltrate that information. And of course, then link that up with other logs, linking that up with our firewall to perhaps see where those files were actually exfiltrated to, and perhaps again map that against the MITRE attack framework and seeing which threat actors have been using the techniques and tactics which have been identified, and maybe even attribute it to an individual threat actors group. So I hope this information has been useful to you. If you do have any questions or would like to discuss the contents of this presentation, please get in touch with your ANSecurity account manager. Thank you.